And joining us now for more discussion on the crisis in East Africa is Faustine Wabwire, Foreign Assistance Policy Analyst at Bread for the World. Bread for the World is a collective Christian voice urging international decision makers to end hunger worldwide. Ms. Wabwire, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Ndimyake.
So how is Bread for the World urging decision makers to end hunger?
Bread for the World, in conjunction with our other church partners, are calling on our leaders in Congress to create a circle of protection against measures that cut aid that supports poor and hungry people, both in the United States and abroad.
Now, of course, as we are looking at the crisis in Kenya, you came up with a report, or you've written a report, analyzing the situation in the Horn areas. And you say that hunger can be prevented if action is immediate and quick. In addition to what is being done now, what are you advocating?
Right now, as Bread for the World, we are strongly encouraging our leaders in Congress and leaders around the world to invest in long-term solutions to address factors that create hunger, to address the causes, and the root causes of hunger are known. So we can invest in agricultural production systems that help to cushion people against hunger and poverty.
And you mentioned to me earlier that you were in northeastern Kenya. We know that the situation is very dire in northern Kenya as a whole, in parts of Ethiopia, eastern part of Ethiopia and Somalia. And you're saying that there is a way that crops can be grown there. It's a question of putting the right mechanism in place. Can you expound on that a little bit?
I think what's very important here is for us to understand the unique dynamics of the regions that are greatly affected by this drought and famine. These regions have very minimal rainfall, and if we are going to think about crops and livestock breeds that can survive in these drought-prone areas, we're going to think about indigenous crops that have been known for many years to be more tolerant to the climate vagaries that we are now currently experiencing in these regions.
Now, if somebody is going to ask, obviously, if there is this possibility, and now you're hearing people are dying because there's no food, what is the breakdown? Why aren't the mechanisms in place to ensure that crops that are drought resistant are grown, and that maybe irrigation systems are in place so that there's food year round?
I think it's largely an issue of policy. We haven't had adequate policies in place that clearly address the needs of these regions. So, for instance, there's a lot of emphasis given on planting maize. And we know that not all breeds of maize will thrive in these areas. So it's a matter of shifting our policies so that we can provide inputs, for example, to farmers who can grow these indigenous crops that are more tolerant to drought and famine in these areas. So to a large extent, it's a matter of lack of credit by farmers to access these seeds, lack of access to fertilizers, and lack of infrastructure in these areas.
We just heard the truck driver saying that is one of the major problems. So even in this case, as people are starving, there is food. It's a question of how do you get it to those who need it? Because some areas, like in Somalia, there's the Al-Shabaab operations. In other areas, there are these infrastructural issues.
That continues to be a large problem, not just in the northern Kenyan region, but when you think of the region we are talking about that are experiencing these drought issues, is on one part of the country, you'll have areas that have bumper harvests, while in the same country, you're having people die of starvation because they just cannot access the food. And infrastructure plays a big role in this. If these farmers can grow their crops, invest and harvest, but they have no means of taking it to the market, then obviously we are having a problem here. So it's not always an issue of demand, but accessibility is a big factor in this.
So, Ms. Wabwire, if you could tell us, obviously the whole world is looking at the situation in the Horn. It's not it's not the first time it's been declared in that region. As Bread for the World, in the report that you did, what are you seeing that needs to be done by governments then to ensure that these things are put in place and that they can work?
I think I'll revert back to my point on getting our priorities straight. We need to seriously look at different regions that require special attention. In the arid and semi-arid lands of these countries that we're talking about, we can begin to invest in livelihood strategies that are viable in these areas. Not all maize crops will flourish in all the areas across the country. So just being aware of that and channeling resources that can help to establish livelihoods that will thrive in these areas is of paramount importance here.
And of course, as Bread for the World, you actually advocate and lobby, you write letters to the various policymakers, decision makers, presidents. So hopefully they'll get that one.
We are very strong on that, and especially right now, we are really calling on our leaders in Congress to form a circle of protection that
Thank you so much.
protects poor hungry people.
Okay, we're watching the situation as it's developing. That's Ms. Wabwire, and we thank her for joining us today on In Focus. And she's with the Bread for the World, actually, here in Washington.